I would say there's probably two outcomes to this election, neither of which suggests to me that US-China relations are really going to improve meaningfully in 2024. The ruling party,
Hmm.
the Democratic Progressive Party, if they emerge victorious, and that is after China has portrayed, this election as a vote between peace and war, it's hard to see Xi Jinping, the leader of China, accepting defeat gracefully. And we have to remember sensitivities are running pretty high in Beijing right now as China confronts a host of domestic and international crises. And so she has made very clear recently that he has a lot of urgency about reunification with Taiwan, perhaps sooner than later. And so I think what that suggests to me is that we could see a pretty serious Chinese overreaction if the ruling party does succeed, which a lot of polls tend to show, although polls can be wrong. If the current ruling party is voted out of power, I think China will meet that reaction sort of with a little bit of a sigh of relief, but it's hardly clear that either of those opposition parties is going to do Beijing's bidding. And that could really lead, I think, China to become frustrated over time. I think what's more frightening about that scenario for the United States, at least, though, is that, China could sort of believe in the event that they can sort of get rid of the ruling party in Taiwan, that they've hit upon this winning political warfare formula, one that expertly blends provocative military action and sort of disinformation and information warfare. And in that case, they would be pretty emboldened to begin deploying that same strategy in other places, including here in the United States, where they are really seeking to sort of meddle already in the upcoming 2024 election in the United States.
Well, that is, a frightening proposition, I think, to many as we talk about our own elections. But on the Taiwan election, for just a moment longer, how much is there for Taiwanese voters a real consideration of independence from China? Is that something that they actually want? Are they likely to seek out the candidate who would most be like supportive of that idea, or is that just the worst case scenario for China that isn't necessarily something that they would like to see realized?
I think long-term voting trends suggest that most Taiwanese voters would prefer the status quo. They're not seeking to poke China in the eye, but they're also increasingly not interested in reunification, and certainly not reunification on China's terms. Those long-term trends are going to be just incredibly frustrating for China. And so this election is particularly important because it could signal whether we see this turn back towards perhaps a slightly more conciliatory approach towards the mainland, or whether the ruling party in power, which has stood up for Taiwanese sovereignty, not independence, but sovereignty, has garnered to stay in power. And I do think that we're going to get a good sense about the average voter sentiment in Taiwan. But I do think that a lot of the talk about independence is largely sort of melodramatic. We haven't seen an indication that Taiwanese voters are pursuing independence, but what they do want is to have a sense of self-determination, and they do want to be able to maintain their democratic system and democratic governance.
We're spending time with Craig Singleton from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's China program. Should the DPP then remain in power, Craig, what kind of a flex might we see from Beijing? Another blockade around the island, send a couple of missiles over. What would it look like?
Yeah, like I said, it's hard to imagine Xi Jinping accepting defeat gracefully here. I think an immediate sort of military reaction, probably through increased military exercises and provocative exercises at that, is a strong possibility. We have to remember that the Chinese leadership has made clear how important and monumental this election is. They have thrown the kitchen sink at Taiwan in the last few months in terms of disinformation, military coercion, economic coercion with new trade subsidies and trade restrictions on Taiwanese companies that are reliant on the mainland. And if all of that effort falls short of achieving their political objectives, I would imagine that there's going to be quite a bit of frustration. Whether that veers towards overreaction or miscalculation remains to be seen, but it's certainly a possibility.
Well, especially keeping in mind that we learned just recently, back in November at that summit in San Francisco between Xi Jinping and President Biden, Xi essentially told him, to paraphrase, that they have every intention of Taiwan being reunified with China, that they would prefer it didn't happen with force. How realistic do you think that is something that's going to happen in the near to medium term, say the next 5 years?
It's really difficult to assess. I think ultimately, I believe she wants to reunify through all means short of war. But there are a lot of circumstances and conditions in which he might consider using kinetic force. I think at the end of the day, we're spending so much time trying to think through different counter moves of how the Chinese could react. Without actually just thinking and looking a little bit about what they're saying in real time. You brought up a great point. Xi Jinping has made clear reunification is inevitable, whether the Taiwanese people want it or not. There are real steps here that we can take in Washington to provide the Taiwanese with the defensive military equipment that they need to defend themselves, while also making clear to China that they should probably accept the results of this outcome, and we should vocally be repeating. I think these conversations are happening privately, but not publicly, that the United States doesn't support any unilateral attempts, whether they're from Taiwan or from China, to change the status quo. I think we should be beating that drum publicly as well as privately, not just to reassure the Chinese, but to make clear to the incoming Taiwanese administration that we're watching. And I think that we're eager to help them with their defense, but we're also going to make sure that we stick through our long-term commitments in the region.
Just got a minute left here, Craig. What does Beijing think of our elections that are about to begin here, the primary cycle, and whether or not Donald Trump becomes the nominee?
Last month, the intelligence community here released a declassified assessment that showed that China meddled extensively and pervasively in our midterms in 2022, even getting involved in picking candidates for Congress and undermining those that were perceived as being anti-China. I think what they're going to do in this coming term is more of the same. There's no indication that the Biden administration has called out Chinese election meddling or threatened them with any sort of consequence if they were to repeat that again. Yeah. But I do think we're going to be very keen to show U.S. democracy is dysfunctional, chaotic, and unreliable. Those are key themes and messages that Chinese are propagating around the world. And I think we can expect that sort of same information warfare theme to be persistent throughout 2024.